Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Alice Hogue and I'll be your instructor. Boudreaux owned a 40-acre ranch in Louisiana. In fact, he just bought that ranch and he was so proud of himself. He was just puffed up and thinking he was somebody special. He decided he was going to go celebrate in Houston, Texas. So he drives all the way to Houston and he goes to the Houstonian. Now, the Houstonian is a famous hotel here in Houston, Texas. That's where Bill Cosby stays when he comes in town. Madonna stayed there when she was doing her concert here. So it's a very prestigious, upscale hotel here in Houston. So Boudreaux goes to the hotel and he gets all set up. He decides he's going to go to the hot tub him. So he goes down to the hot tub and he sees there's already somebody in the tub. He says, how you doing? My name is Boudreaux. What's your name? And the man said, well, my name is Dick Kleberg. I don't know if y'all know, but Dick Kleberg is the owner of the King Ranch. The King Ranch is in South Texas, and it's a huge ranch that's about the size of Rhode Island. That's how big it is. Very well known. When I worked at Exxon, a lot of their properties were with us. So very well known property. And Boudreaux says, oh, well, how you doing, Mr. Kleberg? How you doing? Mr. Kleberg said, well, I'm doing fine. How are you? He says, oh, Mr. Kleberg, we just the same. We just the same. He said, me, I'm doing fine, too. And Mr. Kleberg says, okay. He says, let me ask you a question, Mr. Kleberg. He said, what you do for a living? And Mr. Kleberg said, well, I own a large ranch in South Texas. And Boudreaux says, oh, Mr. Kleberg, we just the same. We just the same. He says, me, I own a large ranch in Louisiana. He says, let me ask you a question, Mr. Kleberg. He said, how big is your ranch? And Mr. Kleberg said, well, if you get in your truck in the morning and you drive all day long, by the time evening falls, you will still not have gone all the way through my ranch. And Boudreaux says, oh, Mr. Kleberg, we just the same. We just the same. He said, me, I got the same kind of truck. Raise your hand if you laughed at that joke. I see two people with their hands up. Okay, I guess it wasn't that funny. For those of you that are new to webinars, there is a little feature where you can raise your hand and it'll tell you if you have a question. Okay, so now let's get started on 5 basic elements of oil and gas contracts. As I said, there are many contracts in the oil and gas industry, and we're going to take module by module, week by week. We're going to look at each of them this week, or some of the major ones. But before you can really understand those contracts, you have to really have a foundation in contract law. And that's why there are those chapters in the AAPL guide on the different kinds of contracts and contract law. So what we're going to do today is I'm kind of going to give you a mini overview of the contract law cases or class that's taught in law schools all across the country, and it's on the state bar of every state in the country. So I want you to have the foundation that you need to determine when a contract is legally enforceable. So what are the 5 basic elements of contract law? But I also want you to understand when a contract is legally binding and how the courts are going to interpret those contracts. This is one of my favorite presentations to give because it affects you both personally and professionally. Everyone needs to know when a contract becomes legally binding, that is legally enforceable by the courts. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over these 5 basic elements of contract law. But you'll understand that even if you have the 5 basic elements, courts are going to interpret contracts based on certain principles. And so I want to go over those principles with you and make sure you understand how a court is going to interpret a contract. And I'll tell you up front, when we're dealing with oil and gas properties, especially like an oil and gas lease, Those contracts are construed against the oil and gas company, against the lessee. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but it's not as black and white as you got the 5 basic elements. Now you've got a binding contract. You've got to know how a court is going to interpret those contracts. And based on that information, we're going to look through some basic oil and gas contracts to determine whether or not they fit the 5 basic elements. And those oil and gas contracts are lease, which we've already covered in Module 2. I may skip over that depending on what the timing is. An AMI. An AMI is what's called an area of mutual interest, and I'll explain that to you when we get to that point. JOA is a joint operating agreement. And then we've got farm outs and farm ins, and we've got assignments. So once we walk through those big picture, we're looking at a big picture overview here, not a lot of detail on those contracts. I just want you to understand what they are. So if someone is bandying terms about, you're going to understand kind of what the terminology is. Okay, and then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. And here we go. Okay. Courts, when we're talking about contracts, courts are trying to determine what was the intent of the parties. You'll see that in law school. In law school, they use that term over and over. What was the intent of the parties? Did they intend to be bound by the contract? Did they understand the nature of their negotiation so that they would understand that this is going to be enforceable by a court? Another terminology that we use is called a meeting of the minds. In other words, was there a point in time when both parties agreed to be bound, where both parties understood we are agreed to be bound? So if I hire you to paint my house and you tell me how much it's going to cost and I agree, that is a meeting of the minds. I have an expectation that you're going to show up at my house and that you're going to paint my house, and you have an expectation that you're going to be paid for your labor. That is a meeting of the minds. The intent of the parties is clear. But sometimes it's not so clear. And so the court says, well, how are we going to know what the meeting of the minds were? How are we going to know the intent of the parties so that we can then validly enforce this contract? We're not a mind reader. There's no way to determine intent of the parties if you can't read their mind. And so courts have put into place certain factors. And they say, okay, if these 5 basic elements are met, we're going to conclude that there was a meeting of the minds and that the intent of the parties was clear. If we have a meeting of the minds and the intent of the parties was clear, we have a valid, legally enforceable contract. So they came up with these 5 basic elements, and you'll note they form the acronym LOCAL, L-O-C-A-L. That's going to be a real easy way for you to remember this. But the L is for legal parties. O is for offer. There has to be an offer. There has to be consideration. There has to be acceptance. And there has to be a lawful purpose. So we're going to go through each of these elements so you'll understand what they are. Beginning with legal capacity or legal parties. Legal capacity means that the person who is executing the contract has the ability to understand what they're doing. They are fully cognizant. So an example might be someone that is has some kind of incapacity, and one is infancy. And what I mean by infancy is that they have not reached the age of majority. Courts seek to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So we say if a person lacks the mental capacity, the legal capacity to enter into a contract, we are going to protect them by saying they lack the legal capacity, therefore there is no binding contract because this critical element was not met. Some examples of incapacity include infancy. That means someone who is a minor, someone who is less than 18 years of age. Now, don't get the age of majority confused with the drinking age. That's different. The drinking age is 21. The age of majority in almost all 50 states is 18. You're old enough to enter to, be drafted into the Army. You're old enough to vote. You're old enough to enter into a contract. But so we're seeking to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So if you have someone that is young, we want to protect them from someone that's going to take advantage of their youth or inexperience. So we say if someone that is younger than 18 enters into a contract, that is not a legally binding contract because this critical element of legal capacity was not met. Other examples are insanity, mental illness. If someone has a mental illness or a mental challenge and they enter into a contract, even if they're over the age of 18, we're going to say that person lacked the mental capacity, the legal capacity to understand that what they were doing was entering into a binding contract. So if that person is insane or has a mental illness and they enter into a contract, that contract cannot be enforced against them. If someone is drunk or is using drugs, I'm not saying an addict because an addict can be sober when they sign it. An alcoholic can be sober when they sign a document. But if someone is truly drunk or someone is under the influence of a mind-altering substance and they sign a contract, the courts are not going to interpret that contract because that person lacked the legal capacity, the mental capacity to do so. So the courts are protecting those that cannot protect themselves. Now in law school, one of the hypotheticals on the final exam was someone that had Alzheimer's. And I know there's a difference between Alzheimer's and dementia, but I can't remember what it is. But on the law school exam, whichever one of these they had, that person suffered from Alzheimer's or dementia, but they had lucid intervals. So there were times in their day, in their life, in their week, where they were crystal clear. They knew who they were. They knew who the people around them were. They, could reason. And so the question, of course, on the law school exam was, is that person capable of entering into a legally binding contract? So those are the kinds of questions that are on law school exams because they're trying to get you to think, the position that I came down on, and, you don't get your paper back, so you don't know if you got it right. You just know if you passed or failed, was that, if I were a court, I would say, who is going to say whether that person had a lucid interval or not? Probably the person around them that was trying to influence them to sign that contract. And so for that reason, I think they're taking advantage of this person. And they're just saying they had a lucid interval. I was there. I saw it. How many witnesses does it take to testify that someone was having a lucid interval? So in my judgment, if they have Alzheimer's or dementia, they lack the legal capacity to enter into a contract. So in those cases, let's say you want to take an oil and gas lease from someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia. What do? You apply to the court to appoint a legal guardian. And a lot of times they will already have a legal guardian. Same thing for someone that is a minor. You have their guardian, their legal guardian, usually it's their parent, sign that lease, and that is binding because the guardian has the authority to bind the minor or the person with some other kind of mental incapacity. So that is what legal capacity is, and you'll run across it dealing with oil and gas leases, and you'll just need to make sure that a guardian is appointed to that person and that you take that oil and gas lease from that guardian. In the case of someone that's 18 or under the age of 18 and their legal guardian signs the lease, the royalty payments, the delay rental payments will be going to that guardian. However, when the person turns 18, they can submit a birth certificate to the oil and gas company, and the oil and gas company then has the authority to start making delay rental payments and royalty payments to them. Okay, so that's a little bit of oil and gas background when we're talking about legal capacity. But we're basically saying, look, if they're mentally incapacitated, there's not going to be a meeting of the minds. The intention of the party is not going to be clear because one party was not clear in their thinking. Okay, the second this should be a 2. The second element is an offer. There has to be an offer, and that is the definition is an indication by one person to another of their willingness to contract on certain terms and without further negotiations. So if I say, will you come paint my house? I'll pay you $500. That's the offer. And so you are saying, hey, I want to enter into a contract with you. I want to enter into an agreement with you. If you do this for me, I'll do this for you. That is the offer. Now, there's something called, when we're talking about offers, there's something called the mirror image rule. And what that says is that an offer has to be accepted exactly as it is without any modifications. So if I said, will you paint my house for $300? And the painter says, I'll do it for $400. Well, that's a different offer. That's a counter offer. Okay. So then I can say, hey, the deal is off. Just forget it. I don't want to negotiate with you. 300 wasn't enough for you, 400. Then they can come back and say, or if they come back and say, hey, wait a minute. Okay, I'll take the 300. The offer's off the table. Okay. When you do not accept the offer exactly as it is stated, you are proposing a counter offer. So now you're the person making the offer, and I'm the person that can refuse it. If we said $300 to paint my house, and you said deal, we have a binding contract because he accepted it exactly as it is. So then I can't then back out of it because the intent of the parties was clear. He didn't make any changes to my original offer. Therefore, we have a binding contract. Now, I'm not saying that you can't change the terms and that you can't negotiate. I want to be crystal clear about that because certainly when we're dealing with leases, that's exactly what's happening, is there is a negotiation. But you run the risk that that person is going to say, okay, forget it. Deal's off the table. I don't want to negotiate with you anymore. So that I just want to make you aware that there is this rule in contract law called the mirror image rule. You have to accept it as exactly. If you counteroffer, it's basically considered a rejection of the original offer, and the contract negotiations begin anew. Does everybody understand that? I'm not saying you can't negotiate. I'm saying you run the risk that the offer gets taken off the table if you change the terms of the contract. Okay, now we're on number 3. This is consideration. L is for legal parties. O is for offer. C is for consideration. Consideration is what makes the contract binding. It is an exchange of something of value. So in the case with the painter in my home, what am I giving up? I'm giving up $300. What is he giving up? He's giving up his time and his labor. So it's a mutual exchange. He's giving up something, I'm giving up something. That is called consideration. Now, you'll notice in an oil and gas contract, an oil and gas lease, for example, sometimes it will say in consideration of, what does it say? $10, $1, $100. $100 in OVC, which stands for other valuable consideration. What is the actual consideration in an oil and gas lease? Well, the consideration is the bonus. The bonus payment is what induces the lessor, the mineral owner, to enter into that oil and gas lease. So that is the consideration. Why don't we put that then on the lease document itself? Why don't we put what the bonus payment is? That is what the consideration is. Well, there's several reasons we don't. One, it's nobody's business what we're paying for bonus in the area. You have seen these very competitive areas where, everything is top secret. And so you don't want it publicized because remember, you're going to have to put this document in the county records to make it binding against third parties, or a memorandum of the document anyway. And you don't want everyone to know what you're paying in the area for bonus payments. The other reason is that you're protecting the landowner. You know, it's like you're paying someone a salary. You then don't go tell everybody what you're paying that person for a salary. It's private information. And so rather than put the actual bonus check amount in the oil and gas lease, we'll put $1, we'll put $10, we'll put $100, we'll put OVC for other valuable consideration. The court does not care what the consideration is. All they care about is that there was consideration. So there has to be consideration stated in the contract in order for it to be a binding contract. So when we put that language in the oil and gas lease, we're basically saying, okay, Your Honor, see, we discussed this. There was something of value that was given up. But why do we have consideration is a different question. And the reason is, well, first of all, it's something of value. It's a bargain. Okay, you're doing something for me and I'm doing something for you, or there was some kind of negotiation with respect to the exchange, and it's mutual. We're both giving up something. But the reason that we have something called consideration is there are three main purposes. First of all, it's cautionary. So what we're saying is, okay, if you know that you're going to have to give up something of value, something that's precious to you, like money, like gold, like silver, whatever you're giving up, you're going to take a second and you're going to go, wait a minute. I'm giving up $300. Let me think about this. Is this really the person that I want to be painting my house? Do I really want to give up this money? So it's going to give you pause. If you have to give up something, if there's a sacrifice on your end that you're having to make, you're going to stop and you're going to say, wait a minute now, do I really want to enter into this contract? The second reason consideration is important is because it's evidentiary. It is proof to the court, Your Honor, there was a negotiation, there was a meeting of the minds here. The intent of the parties was clear as evidenced by the document itself, which says there was consideration. So they went into this knowingly. They were not caught off guard by this. And then it's channeling, not the Shirley MacLaine kind of channeling, but the kind of channeling where you say, okay, I'm giving up $300. Is this the right paint color that I want to use? Is this the right painter that I want to use? Do I want to get the whole interior painted or just the exterior or just a few rooms? It makes you stop and really iron out the details. So that's why we have consideration. The ultimate goal of the court is we don't want to be clogged up by people that didn't intend to be bound by a contract. So the whole goal of consideration is to ensure that contracts are made by serious parties, not made in error. So in order to do that, if you want to have a legally binding contract, everyone has to give up something of value. Then there's a little bit of pain there, and you're going to really sit and think about it before you enter into a contract frivolously. That is the purpose of consideration. It makes you slow down and really think about, did I really intend to be entered into this contract? Are these the details that I wanted worked out? So that's the purpose of consideration. So now we've got legal parties, we've got offer, we've got consideration. Now we're going to move on to acceptance. Acceptance is when the person who makes the offer, when the person who you make the offer to accepts the offer. So it's, okay, I offer to pay you $300 for my house. Okay, am I a legal party? Yes. What's the offer? I'm going to give up $300. What's he going to give up? He's going to give up his time and labor. Once he says deal, then I've got this fourth element. Then I've got acceptance. So the offer is deemed a binding contract, or the contract is binding once we have offer plus consideration plus acceptance. Okay, so now we have legal parties, we have offer, we have consideration, and we have acceptance. Now, when we're talking about acceptance, it has to be communicated to the person to be accepted. So if I show up at your house and I say, I want to lease your property, and I'm going to give you, $2,500 an acre bonus, and I'm going to pay you a 1/4 royalty. And you say, well, I need to think about that, Alice. Let me contact you tomorrow. And that night, when you go to bed, you tell your spouse, you know what, that was really a pretty good deal. I think I'm going to take that offer. And the next morning you wake up and you're dead. Do we have a legally binding contract? Because you really did accept it. All right. But you didn't communicate it to me. Okay. So that would not be a binding contract because you didn't communicate it to the person that made the offer. Just telling your wife, hey, I'm going to accept that, does not constitute acceptance. It has to be communicated to the person that made the offer, and that's what makes it a binding contract. Okay, so you have the 4 basic elements: legal, parties, offer, consideration, acceptance. All right, we need one more letter to make local, and that one is a lawful purpose. So the 5th element is a lawful purpose. And what this means is that, and I know y'all are all going, well, duh, of course, it has to be a lawful purpose, but hang on with me just a second. Lawful purpose just says it's got to be legal. So you can't enter into a contract to do something that is illegal. And Your Honor, we have legal parties, we have offer, consideration, acceptance, but it's not legal. The court is not going to enforce that contract. It's what we call in Latin, contra bonos mores, which means it's against the public good. So we're not going to enforce contracts for things that are illegal. So for example, if I negotiate with you and I say I want to buy so much marijuana from you and I will pay you so much money for that marijuana, you give me the marijuana and I don't give you the money, we can't then go to court and say, Your Honor, I'm suing her for breach of contract. We had an agreement. She's of legal age. The offer was this. Consideration was this. She accepted it. And yet I still don't have the money for the marijuana that I sold her. Courts aren't going to enforce that because marijuana is illegal. Now, I'll tell you that I did this presentation in Denver, Colorado one time and used this example. And after the class, someone came up to me and said, I didn't want to correct you in front of everyone else, but in Colorado, medical marijuana is legal. So this would not apply then in Colorado because it's legal there for medicinal purposes. But let's take another example. I don't know, I'm from Houston. So there was a case a few years ago in Channelview where there was a mother. There were 2 competing cheerleading moms, okay? Their daughters were both cheerleaders, and they were very competitive. And one of the mothers hired a hitman to kill the other mother so the other cheerleader daughter would be so distraught she would lose whatever this upcoming competition was, okay? And so we had all the elements of a legally binding contract. We have on record, she actually was speaking to someone undercover. She was of legal age. She had full capacity. She, had no legal impediments such as a mental challenge. I mean, she wasn't exactly right in the head, but there was nothing about her that would show that she lacked capacity. What was the offer? I'll pay you $10,000 if you kill this woman. What was the consideration? What was she giving up? $10,000. What was the hitman giving up? He was giving up, a chance at, or he was risking going to jail to commit this crime. But because it's not a lawful purpose, it doesn't meet the criteria of the 5 basic elements, and therefore the court is going to say that contract was never formed because it lacked a lawful purpose. Okay, again, you're saying duh. Now, one of my many vices is that I like to watch these court TV shows. I know they're really trashy, and they're, the people on there are not always the most reputable. But I like to see how they apply the law to these cases. And there was a case with Judge Marilyn Milian, and it was a case where it was for back rent. So the person had a contract, a lease agreement, that said that these people were going to pay so much money in rental per month. And those people hadn't paid rent for 3 months. So, they evicted them, but now they're coming back and they're suing them for the 3 months rent that they didn't pay. Okay. Sounds like a pretty clear-cut black and white case. But somehow during the course of the testimony, it came out that this was in an area that was not zoned. It was zoned for residential use only. So it wasn't in an area that was zoned for rental property. And so Judge Marilyn Milian refused to enforce the contract because it lacked a lawful purpose, in that it was illegal for them to have an apartment in an area that was not zoned for apartments or for rental property. So that is another way that the law can be applied and a contract can be invalidated because it lacked a lawful purpose. Okay, so now we've got our 5 basic elements. We've got legal parties, offer. C is for consideration. A is for acceptance. Remember, it's got to be communicated to the person that made the offer. And it's got to have a lawful purpose. All right, so now we know the 5 basic elements, right? So we're done, right? Now you'll know whether or not there's a contract. Now we have to look at how a court is going to interpret the contract itself. There is a principle in contract law that is called the 4 corners of the document. And what it says is that there is a presumption in the law that the written contract, what is in writing, is the complete agreement of the parties. In other words, if you negotiated for a pooling provision in the oil and gas lease, and when that person signed that oil and gas lease, there was no reference to pooling in that agreement, the landman cannot then say, well, wait a minute, I have an email here where it says we agreed that we were going to have a pooling provision. You left me a voicemail, and here's my voicemail, Your Honor, that says you agreed to have a pooling provision in your oil and gas lease. And Your Honor, I can show you texts. I can show you texts where we agreed that this was the way it was. The courts are going to say, you know what? 4 corners of the document, buddy. If it's not within the 4 corners of this lease, we're going to presume it's not a part of the contract. 4 corners of the document. So there's no extraneous evidence that's allowed to prove what the agreement was. It's got to be in the contract itself. The next principle of contract law is that contracts are construed against the drafter. So if you are the person that is drafting this contract and there's an ambiguity in that contract, and you read it one way and it favors you, and you read it another way and it favors the other party, tie goes to the other party. The other party is going to get the benefit of the ambiguity. Why? Because if you are the person that's drafting the contract, you're in a superior position to make that contract crystal clear. And if you don't make it crystal clear, we're going to construe it against you. So you better make sure that contract is crystal clear, because any ambiguity is going to be decided against you. Now, does that mean you should never be the person that drafts that contract? No, that just means take into account when you're drafting the contract, take into consideration that if there's something that is ambiguous or can be read 2 different ways, you're not going to be the successful, your interpretation is not going to be successful because you are the one that drafted that contract. So if you're the drafter of the contract, make sure it is crystal clear. You know, I'm from a large family. We have 7 kids in my family. And, you know, I have 6 brothers and sisters, let me say. And, you know, Mom would come home from the grocery store and she would have a box of those moon pies. I don't know if y'all are familiar with them. Y'all probably are. And what she would say is, you know, she would every 2 kids would get one. And so we had to split that moon pie. Okay. So one person would cut it and the other person would choose which half they get. So you better believe the person that was cutting the moon pie was going to be very careful that they cut it exactly down the middle, because they knew if they didn't, they would end up with a smaller piece. So it's sort of the same concept, is that, look, if you're going to be the one that's cutting that moon pie, that other person's going to be able to pick the interpretation that they want, or the bigger side of that moon pie. And that's called the moon pie principle. No, I'm kidding. So then number 3 is leases are construed against the lessee. You've got to know this if you're in the oil and gas industry. Leases are construed against the oil and gas company. Okay, so what they're saying is if there is an ambiguity in an oil and gas lease and you read it one way and it favors the oil and gas company, and you read it another way and it favors the landowner, the courts are going to read it in favor of the landowner. Okay, why? Well, because we have unequal bargaining power here. How many oil and gas attorneys and professional landmen and people that are familiar with the law does the oil and gas company have on their staff? Okay, and then what is the little old lady landowner? How many attorneys does she have? Well, if she's wealthy, she might have one, but for the most part, she probably doesn't have any. So again, the courts are trying to seek to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And so we say, okay, you big bad oil company, we're not going to let you swoop in and take advantage of these little people. So just so you know, if it's in the lease, it's going to be construed against you. So you oil and gas company better be crystal clear in that lease, because it's going to be construed against you and not the little old lady landowner. So that's very important to recognize, that the leases are construed against the lessee in an oil and gas lease. Again, seeking to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Okay, there was one other principle in here, and that is that the typewritten materials take precedence over the printed form. Take precedence over the printed form. Go ahead and add that to your slide. Over the printed form. And so what that means is that if we have a lessee that signs an oil and gas lease, okay, and the printed form maybe says a 1/8 royalty, okay, that's in print on the form itself. And then attached to that as Exhibit A, we have typed out the royalty shall be 1/4. Okay, this is going to trump whatever's in the printed form. Why? Because someone has taken the time to, I was going to say scroll it into a typewriter, but to get their word processor out and to create these provisions. So that means to the court that someone has taken the time to really think these things through, and it is what they really meant, or they would have just left the form alone. So the typewritten materials take precedence over the printed form. That's another contract law principle that you will see when we're talking about oil and gas leases. Okay, so now let's talk about what a breach of a contract is and some defenses to the breach of contract. A breach of contract is basically when you fail to comply with the terms of the agreement. The definition I have here is a failure without a legal excuse to perform any promise which forms the whole or part of the contract. So if I don't pay this painter his $300, I'm in breach of contract. If I pay him only $150, I have breached the contract. If he doesn't paint the whole house or stops midway, he will, I'm sorry, I was just reading an email from someone. He has breached the contract. Yvonne says, typewritten materials take precedent over the printed form. Yvonne, sorry if I wasn't clear on that. Typewritten materials take precedence over the printed form. Now, if you breach the contract, the result is going to be contract termination, and or you're going to have to pay a certain sum of money, because this guy didn't get his his full amount, so you owe him that full amount, and they might even tack on some punitive damages just to teach you a lesson so you won't be clogging up the courts again. So that is the breach of contract damages that you can get as a result. All right. Now, when we're talking about contract law defenses, they really fall into two categories. Number one is, Your Honor, the contract was never formed. There is no contract. Okay. Or number two, yes, Your Honor, the contract was formed, but there is a valid reason that we didn't go through with the performance of the contract. So the argument against formation would be if any of the 5 basic elements are not met. So if there's no legal parties, if there's no offer, no consideration, no acceptance, or no legal parties, any one of these could create a defense that the contract was never formed. Okay, so that's incapacity and illegal purpose. Now, when we're talking about real property, it has to be in writing. Remember, there is no verbal contract for a conveyance of real property. So that is called the statute of frauds. So if we're dealing with real property and it's not in writing, then we can say the contract was never formed because it has to be in writing for real property. Duress is another defense against formation. What it says is basically, look, this person signed, but they were under some kind of duress. They were either at gunpoint, or a lot of times it's someone who is dying, and they're we see this when they leave everything in their will to the nurse that took care of them. That's a red flag, because that means that person was in a under duress to sign this contract. And if that is the case, if they signed the contract under duress, then the defense is, Your Honor, this contract was never formed because of duress. So these are the defenses against formation. It didn't have one or more of these essential qualities, or it was the statute of frauds. It wasn't in writing and it was real property, or there was some kind of duress involved. So those are the arguments or the defenses against non-formation. The defense against non-performance is misrepresentation. That is when someone presents the information one way and they misrepresent it, so that the person then signs the contract believing it's one way because it was misrepresented. And in that case, we say, Your Honor, yes, the contract was formed, but we're not going to, we don't believe we're bound to perform it because there was some kind of misrepresentation involved here. Another example is impossibility. I think I'll cover that in a minute. Okay. Yeah, so let's look at misrepresentation and impossibility. When we're talking about misrepresentation, we're talking about a false statement that induces a party into a contract. So I'm declaring, hey, I'm going to pay you $500 if you paint my house, and you paint your house, and I, in fact, say I'm only going to pay you $300. Or let's say the painter says that he's he's a licensed painter and he has lots of experience. Okay, that's a false statement that induces me to enter into a contract because I think he's an experienced painter, or that's what I want. In that case, you say, yes, Your Honor, the contract was formed, but he misrepresented his credentials, and therefore I don't think I should have to perform this contract. The remedy is rescission of the contract, means they dissolve the contract, and or damages. Okay. There was an episode of a couple of years back. There was a show called Medium on television. It was Patricia Arquette was the medium, and she was basically sort of a Alison Dubois. She played a character named Alison Dubois, who is a real medium who claims that she can, find out where a crime occurred or where a dead body was buried or that kind of thing based on their intuition or their instinct or this superior gift or ability. And in this particular episode, Kelsey Grammer is the executive producer of the program, and in this particular program, Kelsey Grammer, played someone who sold viaticals. I don't know if any of you have heard this terminology. Selling of viaticals. Okay, and what the sale of viaticals is let's say, for example, you are someone that is, has just been diagnosed with cancer, all right, and you really want to live. I mean, you really will do anything to survive. And you don't really have any money, but you do have a life insurance policy. The person that is selling the viaticals will say, look, if you make me the beneficiary of your will or of your life insurance, rather, let's go with life insurance. If you put me down as the beneficiary of your life insurance, I will give you the money that you need to fight for cancer. Okay, I will give you a sum of money that will allow you to have the treatments that you want to have to cure your cancer. He's not guaranteeing that the cancer will be cured, but he's saying, you make me a life insurance, you make me the beneficiary of your $1 million, $2 million life insurance policy, and I'll give you the money that you need to get the cures that you need for the cancer. Is that a legally binding contract? Well, let's look at the 5 basic elements. Number 1, are they legal parties? Well, yeah, I mean, you have cancer, okay, but you still have your, full facilities about you. I mean, you know what's going on. You understand you're sick. You want to get better. You have a reason to live. So, yeah, both parties are legal parties. They're both over the age of 18. What is the offer? The offer is, I will pay you money if you make me the beneficiary of your life insurance policy. Okay? What is the person that's selling the viaticals in the Medium episode, Kelsey Grammer? What was he giving up? He was giving up money. Okay? What was the person that had cancer? What were they giving up? They were giving up their beneficiary in their life insurance policy. So instead of that going to a relative, that was going to go to Kelsey Grammer, the person that's selling the viaticals. So we have legal party, we have offer, we have consideration, right? Consideration for the cancer patient. He loses his right to give his life insurance policy to someone he's related to. Kelsey Grammer, what's he giving up? He's giving up the money so the person can survive cancer. Acceptance. Let's say it's accepted. Let's say both parties, say, hey, yeah, this is what I want. It's communicated. Is it a lawful purpose? Is this legal? What do you think? Anybody? And the answer is, yeah, this is perfectly legal. Good job, Caden. Yes, this is perfectly legal. I mean, these parties have the right to enter into a contract. Well, you say, well, what about duress? This person was obviously under some form of duress. That contract should not be enforced. Well, what if that was you? What if you were the one that had cancer? Don't you have the right to do whatever you have to do to survive, even if it includes giving away the beneficiary to someone you don't know? That would be worth it to a lot of people. So in this episode of Medium, every time Patricia Arquette, or Alison Dubois, her character, would shake hands with Kelsey Grammer, she would get this weird feeling. And she kind of would, she'd almost jerk her hand away as if he was hot. And she couldn't figure out what was going on. She knew what he was doing. She knew he was selling viaticals. Everyone she talked to said, that's perfectly a reasonable thing to do. And yeah, a lot of people are doing it and they're making money. And, if the patient, after getting paid a certain sum of money still dies, that person collects $1 million. And, this guy was apparently getting really rich doing this. So what they came to find out in the episode was that Kelsey Grammer was in cahoots with the doctors that were treating the patients. And the doctors would make sure the person didn't survive, and then Kelsey Grammer would get 50% of the life insurance, and the doctor would get 50% of the life insurance. Okay, that is illegal. Okay, that is fraud. That is misrepresentation. That is duress. That's a crime. That's called murder. So clearly, that is clearly that would not be acceptable. But the mere selling of viaticals is. So I just want you to recognize that, even though it's something that may sound, and that's the benefit of these 5 basic elements, is a lot of times a contract will not sound right to you. A contract will seem like, well, that's just not right. That's just not fair. And you really have to sit back and analyze it. This is what they teach you to do in law school. You can't get emotionally involved in the story. You know, your sympathy is obviously with the cancer patient here. Instead of doing that, you have to say, okay, wait a minute. Logically, was there a legal party? Was there offer, consideration, acceptance, lawful purpose? All that's fine. This is a legally binding contract, whether or not it's abhorrent to you or not. You have to look at the 5 basic elements. So that's one defense. He misrepresented himself, Your Honor. The other one is impossibility. So if you agree to paint my house for $300 and you're going to come on Friday and paint the house, and Thursday night my house burns to the ground, I can't then sue you for breach of contract because it was impossible. There was no way you would be able to perform that contract. So impossibility is an excuse for non-performance of a contract based on a change of circumstances that makes the performance impossibility. So those are the 2 contract law defenses that say, yes, Your Honor, the contract was formed, but there was either misrepresentation or impossibility. Therefore, we should not have to go through with the contract itself. Okay, so now let's look at how this works for oil and gas contracts. And this is the part where we just kind of go over that what the different contracts are, and we're going to walk you through the basic elements. This little picture is not coming out that good. Okay, so the definition of contracts for a lease, as you know, it's when the property owner agrees to let the oil and gas company come onto their property to drill and develop land for a certain period of time. So who are the legal parties? The legal parties are the mineral owner and the oil and gas company. What is the offer? The offer is, if you let me come on your land and drill for oil, the consideration is the bonus payment. And then we have acceptance. And is this a lawful purpose? Yes, this is a perfectly lawful purpose. So legal parties is the mineral owner. Let's not say property owner. Let's say mineral owner and the lessee. The offer is, if you let us have access to your property and minerals, we're going to give you royalty payment and a bonus payment. It's accepted when it's executed, okay? Is this a lawful purpose? Yes, very much so, a lawful purpose. Now, it's got to be executed to be considered a binding lease agreement, because remember, under the statute of frauds, if we're dealing with real property, it's got to be in writing. So execution is what shows that it's accepted, not just saying, okay, I accept your offer. There's no verbal agreements for real property. Okay, does this need to be recorded to be binding against third parties? And the answer is yes, because it's a conveyance of real property, not a sale, but a lease of real property. In that case, it's got to be recorded in the county records so that you can prove to the world that your oil and gas company is the owner of the lease. AMI agreement. So an AMI agreement stands for Area of Mutual Interest. And the way it works is that, let's say that you and I are oil companies in a given area. Let's say there's 3 or 4 oil companies, okay? There's Hogue Oil and Gas Company. There's your oil and gas company. There's Exxon, and there's Shell. All right, so I'm going to let's say there's a landowner here, and we're all trying to get this property here, okay? And so I'm going to approach this landowner, and I'm going to say, I'm going to give you $300 an acre and a 1/8 royalty. They say, no, I think I'll pass. Then your oil and gas company says, okay, we're going to give you $700 an acre, and we're going to give you a 3/16 royalty. And he says, no, I think I passed. So then Exxon comes along and they say, okay, I'll give you $800 and I'll give you a 3/16. No, I don't think so. Shell comes along and you see the bonus rate goes up and up and up, and the royalty rate goes up and up and up. All right. So what would happen instead is that I would call your company, I would call Exxon, and I would call Shell and say, hey guys, look, we're all competing in this area. Let's say whoever gets the lease will split the rest of it with us, okay? So if I'm the one that goes in and gets this oil and gas lease, I'm then going to keep 25% of it, and I'm going to convey 25% to you and 25% to Exxon and 25% to Shell, okay? Say, look, this is an area where we all have a mutual interest in it. Instead of, competing against each other to get the best deal, let's just take it from out of the hands of the landowner. Let's take that bargaining power away from her, and let's say just one of us will approach. And it doesn't matter who it is, because we're all going to split the revenue, or we're going to split our share into it. Okay, that is an area of mutual interest agreement. This is our agreement. The agreement is, if you get a lease, I get a share of it. If I get a lease, you get a share of it. That is called an AMI agreement. So now it doesn't matter who gets the lease over here, because we're all going to split it. So it really reduces the amount of competition in the area. It takes the authority away from the power rather, away from the lessor. All right, so that is different though, and I want to be really clear about this. That is different from violating antitrust laws. When I was at Exxon, they showed us a video of a landman who had been convicted for 10 years in federal prison for a violation of antitrust laws. And this is how it happened. And if you're a landman, you will very easily see how this kind of thing could happen. But what happened was, they were all staying at the same hotel. All these different competitors were staying at the same hotel in the same little town. They were eating at the same restaurants. They were drinking at the same bars. They were, renting from the same rental car company. So they were constantly seeing each other. So one day I say, hey, why don't y'all come to my hotel room and we'll have drinks? And so everybody says, sure. They bring a 6-pack and we're all sitting around and we're drinking. And I say to you, hey, what are you paying for royalty in this area? And you say, oh, well, we're paying $700 an acre. And I'll say, oh, wow. What we're paying is this $300 an acre. Exxon, what are you paying? Oh, we're paying $800. Wow. What about you, Shell? Oh, we're paying $900. Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. I mean, look at the benefit to the landowner. We're all competing against each other. Let's have an agreement right now, right here. Let's say none of us goes over $300. Okay? That is the bar. You can't pay $900. You have to pay $300. And if we all agree, what choice does this landowner have? That's the only offer they're going to get is for $300. So everyone says, yeah, it's a great idea, great idea, great idea, great idea, great idea. So they start the negotiations, and suddenly I get arrested. And what am I arrested for? I'm arrested for a violation of the antitrust laws. Okay, and that is that you cannot agree to fix the market. You cannot agree to monopolize the market and price fix. You cannot set that price. Okay, so I get arrested. Okay, who told on me? How does the federal government know that I entered into this agreement in my hotel room? Well, somebody found out, and one of you guys turned state's evidence, and you're going to be the party to testify against me. Because look, these people are competitors. They're not your friends. They're going to save their neck and call you out, and then you're going to be in the federal penitentiary for 10 years. A lot of landmen are not familiar with these antitrust laws. but they have very serious consequences. And you remember the old adage is that ignorance of the law excuses no man. So even if you say, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was a law. Well, just because you're ignorant of what the law is does not excuse you from the law. So I want everyone to be aware of it. Now, in your discussion forum, what I have for you is if you're setting up this AMI agreement and you set up the price in the AMI agreement, is that a violation of the antitrust laws? That's the question. And, you know, my inclination is you never set the price. You never set it, you know, verbally. You never set it in writing because you just don't want to run that risk. And you say, well, you know, you have to take risks when you're doing work. Well, recognize that the risk isn't to your oil and gas company. The risk is to you personally. The risk is that you are thrown in federal prison for 10 years. Think about your kids. Think about your family. I mean, is that really worth the risk? So my answer is, you know, it shouldn't be in there. Now, other oil and gas companies in classes that I've taught have told me that they do agree up front what that bonus payment is going to be. You're running the risk that that might be price fixing. The argument is, you know, how big an area are we talking about? Do you really have control of the market or a monopoly of the market? I mean, if it's an area this size and you and I agree we're going to split it, okay, that would be price fixing. But if it's a huge area, is that price fixing? I don't know. It's something that's going to have to decide it on a case-to-case, case-by-case basis. But I want you all to be aware of this because I want you to understand there is a difference between an AMI agreement and violating antitrust laws. Because when we're saying everybody gets 25%, we're not setting a threshold. We're saying whoever gets it splits it. So when we're talking about an AMI, the legal parties are usually one or more oil and gas companies. The offer is if you acquire a lease in the designated area, we're going to own an interest. The consideration is if we acquire an interest in the designated area, we're going to give you an interest or assign an interest to you. It's got to be executed because of the statute of frauds. We're dealing with real property. Is this legal? Well, it's legal as long as you don't violate the antitrust laws. Okay. Does this have to be recorded to be binding against third parties? The answer is no. It has to be recorded when it is a conveyance of land or something like a lease or a mortgage or a sale. Then it has to be recorded. But this is an agreement between oil and gas companies. And it's really not affecting the land. It's just affecting the way you handle the lease acquisition itself. So this does not need to be recorded. In fact, most companies do not record this because they don't want the other competitors to know that, you know, they've kind of joined forces with some other people. So this does not need to be recorded to be binding against third parties because it's not the actual sale. Now, when we assign the interest out, yes, that would need to be recorded because an assignment of a lease is affecting the real property. Oil and gas contracts, farm outs, farm ins. We're going to talk about this next week, but I want you to understand kind of big picture what this is. This is if you have property, your company has property that's about to expire. Okay, let's say it expires by the end of this month, March 31st. And you don't think that property is worth anything. You're going to let those leases expire. Okay, I come along and I say, oh my gosh, our geologist tells us there is another Haynesville shale in this area and we don't have a lease in this area. So I'm going to approach you and I'm going to say, hey, if you let me drill on your land, if I'm successful, I'm going to give you an overriding royalty interest. Okay, you're not going to have to pay any of the costs or any of the expenses. I'm going to take care of all of that. If it's a dry hole, you're not out anything. All right, so you're thinking, okay, well, we took this lease, but it is about to expire, and we really don't think there's anything in there. So yeah, we're going to let this company come in and drill on the property And then if it's a successful well, we're going to get 3%. Otherwise, if we just let it expire, we get nothing. Okay, so you have farmed out your acreage to me. You're letting me come onto your acreage and drill for you. And then if it's successful, you're going to get 3% and I'm going to get an acreage position. That's all it is. It's letting someone else come onto your land and drill on your leased property. For whatever reason, you don't think it's good acreage, it's about to expire, you can't afford it, whatever the deal is. So that's what a farm out is. It's letting someone come in or you're asking someone to, you're basically farming out your interest to allow someone else to come on your land and drill for oil and gas. So the legal parties is it's usually two lessees. The offer is, or it's usually a lessee and another oil and gas company who doesn't have a lease interest in the area. The offer is if you let us drill on your lease and we're successful, we'll give you an interest. The consideration is like a 3% override, and sometimes they'll have what's called a back end for a working interest. Yes, we accept it. We execute it. Under the statute of frauds, it's got to be in writing. Is this a lawful purpose? Yes, it's a perfectly lawful purpose. Does it have to be recorded in the county courthouse records to be binding against third parties? No, it does not, because it's not a sale or conveyance of the property itself. It's saying if we're successful, then we'll assign an overriding royalty interest. Joint operating agreement, we'll talk about this the last week. This is an agreement between the working interest owners. So in our first AMI agreement, we had me, we had you, we had Shell and Exxon. Okay, now we're all going to jointly develop this property. And so let's agree up front what our different roles are, who's going to be the operator, how we're going to cover costs, who gets what percent of the production. That's what a joint operating agreement. It is to manage producing properties or develop oil and gas producing properties. Legal parties, it's usually the working interest owners in an area. If you will contribute your leases and pay for your share of the drilling costs, we'll share the costs and benefits of drilling. What are you going to get out of it? You're going to get a working interest in the well and the right to participate in additional wells. Acceptance is it's got to be executed according to the statute of frauds. Lawful purpose, perfectly legal. Does it have to be recorded? No, it doesn't. There is one exception to that, which we'll go over that third week. But in general, joint operating agreement is an agreement between the working interest owners. Typically, it does not have to be recorded. Assignment, that is the legal transfer by one party of all of its rights of a leasehold interest, basically. You're going to assign your interest out to somebody. Legal parties are someone who owns an interest is going to convey it out. If you give us an interest in your leases, we're going to pay you money. So it could be an override or a working interest. It does have to be executed, and it does have to be recorded to be binding against third parties. So that is the 5 basic elements, L, O, C, A, L. Let's see if you can remember. L, legal parties, O, offer, C, consideration, A, acceptance, lawful part, and L is for lawful purpose. Then we went over the contract law principles. We talked about the 4 corners of the document rule. We talked about contracts are construed against the lessee. We talked about the leases are construed against the lessee. And then we looked at the defenses to contract law. We said one of them is, the contract was never formed. The other one is the contract was formed, but there's a reason that we can't perform. Either there was misrepresentation or there is an impossibility. I told you about Kelsey Grammer and the selling of viaticals. And then we looked at the basic oil and gas contracts, the lease, the AMI, the joint operating agreement, farm outs and farm ins. And we looked to see if they met the 5 basic elements. And then we wrap up with a conclusion. Are there any questions related to oil and gas contracts? Okay, if there's no questions, I'll stop recording, and then thank you for attending this webinar.